Good evening, everyone. I'm Peggy Ueda, Chair of the Jaffrey Ringe MLK Committee. As a prologue to our event this evening, I'd first like to thank the many people, businesses, and organizations whose support make our programs possible. We thank our generous sponsors, Community Center of Jaffrey and Franklin Pierce University. Tonight's program was funded in part by grants from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation's Putnam Foundation and GFA Federal Credit Union. And special thanks to the many who donated time, effort, free or discounted services, or otherwise collaborated with us, including the United Church of Jaffrey, Jaffrey Ringe Schools, Jaffrey Ringe Rotary Interact Club, Savron Graphics, John Seepy Social Media, Ingalls Memorial Library, Millipore Sigma, and the Park Theater. Now I wish to share a letter we received from the Honorable Senator Jean Shaheen. Senator Shaheen learned about our program and reached out to express her support. United States Senate, Washington, D.C., January 17, 2022. Dear friends, I will be with you in spirit as you gather at the Park Theater to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The event's theme, Power to Heal, Hope for America's Deeply Divided Society, could not be more timely or urgent. It's important to remember that what unites our American family is much stronger than what divides us. Whether writing from inside a jail cell or speaking from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King delivered a stirring message with hope that Americans could come together and fully realize one of our country's founding principles, that all are created equal. He pledged himself and inspired others to learn from the past and work toward a more perfect union that embraces a belief in freedom and opportunity for all. And he held a faith that engaged citizens, from the thousands who stood with him on the National Mall in 1963 to the many who lead the charge today to strengthen voting rights, have the power to advance positive social and economic change. The best way we can honor Dr. King is to carry on his work and create the inclusive future for which he so fervently fought. My best wishes to you all as you continue this meaningful work. Sincerely, Jean Shaheen, United States Senator. I'm pleased now to turn to Committee Member Owen Houghton to start the ceremonies.
Welcome, all of you, our beloved community. Those of you who would have been our audience here at the Grand Park Theater in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and all of you supporters of the 8th Annual Jaffrey Ringe MLK celebration who are watching this gathering by Facebook live stream. We salute the Park Theater staff and the MLK committee who have persevered throughout this pandemic and tonight's weather to keep the tradition of celebrating Dr. King alive in all our communities. The Paul Revere Bell at the United Church up the street from here has been rung today by our interactors as part of the National Registered ceremony. We are called to a grateful celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. So let us begin with an invocation by the Reverend Mark Koyama of the United Church.
An invocation. As we gather, let us invoke the intention of holiness. And what does this mean, to invoke the intention of holiness? It means that we feel a deep respect for each other and for what has come before us. Holiness, as the great prophet of our time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., told us, is to see into each other, not at the color of our skin, but into the content of our characters. Holiness, as those who came before us on this land, the Abenaki, teach us, is to see into the depths of a place, to see and to be, to see not just a tree or a lake, not just a sky or a mountain, to see and to be, to understand that the rhythm of our pulse is the rhythm of eternity, that these sacred lands sustain us as they sustained the people of the Dawn lands for thousands of years before Europeans came. Let us gather, and let us invoke the intention of holiness. Give this intention with open hands and open hearts to each other, to our lands, and to those who came before us on this land. In the name of all that is holy, now and evermore. Amen.
There comes a moment when my heart must stand alone on this lonely path I've chosen, like a house that's not a home. If my heart don't be no doubt, after the world will come giving up, empty, all I can be, now nothing can stop me. I believe in the power that comes from the well brought together as one. I believe together we'll fly. I believe in the power of you and I. This is the moment we have dreamed of all our lives. We'll be the change we wish from others. We'll stand tall for what is right. And in my heart there'll be no doubt, the earth of the world will come reaching out. And it's to be all I can be, now nothing can stop me. I believe in the power that comes from the world brought together as one. I believe together we'll fly. I believe in the power of you and I. Believe in the power of you and I.
In his own words, we continue our tradition of inviting a young person to understand and articulate Dr. King's vision of one humanity. A member of the Jeffrey Ringe Committee and a Conant Jr., Ella Weinman, will read his own words.
In 1963, Martin Luther King was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, for violating their anti-protest injunction set in place 2 days prior. 8 Birmingham clergymen released a public statement criticizing Dr. King for his untimely and unwise protests as an outsider that had no business in Birmingham. They agreed with the overall sentiment behind the protests, but thought that the negotiations through the court system was the correct way to enact change. I'm about to read to you 2 sections of Dr. King's response labeled Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he broke down their argument and explained his point of view. In this first section, Martin Luther King addressed the clergyman's view of him as an outsider who should not meddle in Birmingham affairs. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outsider-agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider, anywhere within its bounds. This last section I am going to read confronts the idea that all protests are unwise. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of a nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. Thank you.
The theme for this year is Power to Heal, and the program is aimed at challenging us all to recommit to King's call to build a beloved community. Dr. James Waller is going to give us our keynote address, and his introduction was prepared by Dr. Dottie Morris, who has supported our committee over the years. Dr. Waller is the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and chairman of the same department at Keene State College. In addition, he serves as Director of Academic Programs for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. an international non-governmental organization devoted to atrocity preventions. He's the author of many books and held numerous professorships, most recently honoring visiting research professor at the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace. In 2017, he was an inaugural recipient of the Engaged Scholarship Prize from the International Association of Genocide Scholars in recognition of his exemplary engagement in advancing genocide awareness and prevention. It's our pleasure to have him here at the Park Theater as our keynote speaker. Dr. Waller, welcome.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you to the Jaffrey Bringe Martin Luther King Day Committee for the invitation, and thank you to my colleague, Dr. Morris, for providing those kind words of introduction. It's wonderful to be with you all tonight. I wish we could be in person. The committee did everything they could to be able to pull off at least some part of this program in person, but the pandemic and nature seem to conspire against us, but we appreciate very much you taking the time to be with us here virtually tonight. In doing so, you've taken a big step toward answering the question of tonight's address, which is, what is the hope? How do we go about healing a deeply divided society? I think one of the great geniuses, of many geniuses of Dr. King, was that he was able in his speeches and writings to both challenge us and at the same time open up avenues of hope and possibility. Anytime I listen to Dr. King's speeches or I read his writings, one of the things that goes through my mind is the saying that every story has the room for a better ending. So no matter how dark a period of history seems to be, or a period of time seems to be, every story, every moment, every journey has the possibility and capacity for a better ending. So what I'd like to share with you tonight in my brief remarks is to talk a bit about some of the challenges I think we're facing as a country, and to talk about some of the ways forward in addressing those challenges. So Stephen, if you could start the slideshow presentation, please. Thank you very much. Tonight's keynote, Power to Heal, Hope for America's Deeply Divided Society. It will come as no surprise to any of us that we do live in a deeply divided society, and the events of the past year or so have certainly confirmed much of those things as we've looked at the headlines and we looked at the insurrection of January 6th. Again, though, those challenges do not come without hope. They do not come without opportunity. And what I'd like to share are some of my thoughts about those challenges and avenues for opportunity, contextualize a bit in some of the broader work I do in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. Next slide, please. The two books I've written most recently, Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide, came out in 2016. And last year, A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland came out. Both books were published by Oxford University Press. But I start with these two because in Confronting Evil, one of the chapters of that book looked at risk factors. In other words, when we look at countries around the world that are unstable, that are fragile, that are failing, that are at the risk of collapse, even at the risk of political violence, maybe even mass violence, what are the indicators we can see ahead of time that warn us about countries on the verge of those type of risk? And in A Troubled Sleep, I looked specifically at the case study of Northern Ireland, and I took that template of risk factors and I said, looking at Northern Ireland from the standpoint of what we know about risk, what are our concerns about this country and its current fragility? Next. And before A Troubled Sleep came out, next slide, please, Stephen. Before A Troubled Sleep came out, I did the same process of looking at the US. I was asked by a think tank policy group, the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, to look at the US specifically through the lens of risk and resilience, and to try to come on some understanding about what the potential for the escalating risk of mass violence was in the US. I finished and published this paper, about 30 pages in length, the first week of November before the election. And in the paper, I had said, while the US is not a failed or failing state, it is a fragile one and a flailing one. It's closer to breakdown than a breakthrough. And in the paper, I had argued that the potential for a significant episode of political violence between the time of the election and inauguration was significantly high in the US. And unfortunately, that particular potential became reality, as we know, on January 6th. And one of the things I said in the paper is, if people were looking at any other country in the world with some of the risk factors and challenges we're facing, they would look at that country and recognize important hard work needs to be done here, because these challenges are significant challenges, and these divisions are significant and deep divisions. So tonight, what I'm asking you to do with me is to have the courage to look at our country the way we might look at another country, a Northern Ireland, a Ukraine, Guatemala, a Venezuela, a Central African Republic, and to ask those same hard questions of those countries, to ask those questions of ourselves as well. Next slide, please. So I want to present what I think are 5 significant challenges we're facing right now. And again, for each challenge, give some sense of hope in terms of possible areas that we could commit to tonight as we commemorate the life of Martin Luther King Jr. I think the first challenge we face is a challenge that unfortunately is faced globally, and that's the challenge of democratic backsliding. Next slide, please. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I happened to be teaching in Germany this year when the wall came down. And I remember that the general sense, and many of you remember this as well, is that the fall of the wall ushered in this great new era of democracy. Communism was dead. Authoritarian regimes were dead. Democracy would grow and flourish and develop in parts of the world where democracy hadn't been in place for generations. And the spirit of 1989, when the wall came down, if you looked in journals in political science and political psychology and foreign relations, they all talked about this expected explosion of democracy around the world. And in truth, that explosion did happen. For about the next 10 to 15 years, we saw many authoritarian countries moving more toward democratic countries. We saw minority peoples who were under threat in authoritarian regimes now experiencing rights and privileges in democracies that they had not experienced before. But that blossoming of democracy, as a surprise to all of us, was incredibly short-lived. Next slide, please. Over the past 10 years or so, we have seen a consistent decline in democracies around the world, a backsliding in democracies and democratic institutions. This is a graphic from Freedom House that shows last year, of the 41 established democracies we had in the world, 25 of them suffered overall declines in how the government functioned, freedom of expression and belief, a commitment to the rule of law. And you'll see that one of those 25 countries who suffered significant decline was the United States. Next slide, please. If we look at the number of democracies by year from 2015 to 2020, we see a pretty precipitous decline over the course of just this recent 5-year period in countries that have been established as democratic countries with functioning democratic institutions. Next slide, please. Globally, this gives you perhaps a better sense of some of the threat we're facing in terms of democracy. In the red, orange, yellow ranges, we see countries that tend toward more authoritarian regimes. In terms of full democracies, we see Canada and a few Scandinavian countries. The US has been classified as a flawed democracy since 2016. But overall, globally, if you look at the world, you recognize that democracy is in significant decline. Many people are writing about the death of democracy globally. Next slide, please. Closer to home in the US, we've seen, as we've said, a significant decline in how many of our democratic institutions function. This is another graphic from Freedom in the World that shows, compared to 2010, we've had an 11-point decline over the past 10 years, driven by political corruption, conflicts of interest, lack of transparency in government, punitive and punishing immigration, asylum policies. So we've been moving backwards as a democracy in many ways, in similar ways as many countries around the world. Next slide, please. And perhaps we've seen this most significantly when people are asked the question, to what degree do they trust our government? To what degree do we trust the presidency? Here's a poll that shows that this decline has been a long time coming. From 1991 on, we see, generally speaking, year after year after year of decline in trust and confidence in the presidency. In 2020, only 39% of people could say that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the presidency. Most disconcerting for us is we see in a recent poll, when people were asked if Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the 2020 presidential election, only 18% of people who voted for the former defeated President Trump say yes, President Biden is a legitimate winner. So, in one of the things that's a hallmark of a democracy is open, free, and fair, and honest and legitimate elections, the US is certainly struggling, at least from the standpoint of the perception of some people in the legitimacy of those elections. Next slide, please. So what's important for us here is a way forward. And I'll talk about 5 ways forward tonight, but this one, in response to the first challenge, is we have to recognize and commit to reverse our democratic backsliding. And I think a couple of things are important for us to do here. We have to preserve democracy at our state legislatures. We can't be distracted, for lack of a better word, by focusing our attention on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Where our attention should be focused is the front pages of the Monadnock Ledger, the Concord Monitor, because the battle for democracy is taking place where it always takes place. That's at state legislatures. Where democracy is under attack today is at state legislatures. To give you one example, this past year in 2020, 19 states around the US passed legislation related to voter restriction laws, making it more difficult for people to vote. New Hampshire was one of those states. The erosion of democracy is going to take place at that state level, and all of us have a responsibility to respond to that. We want to make sure that we are legislating in ways that affirm majority rule rather than enable the rule of a minority party or minority voters. So it's that focus on the majority and the focus on democracy at the state level that's very important for us to recognize. Next slide, please. Our second challenge is a significant one, which many of us feel, which is the challenge of social fragmentation. Next slide, please. In deeply divided societies, social identity is very important. Your group identity, your political group, your racial group, your ethnic group, your religious group, your gender group, all of these are social identities that become very important to us in deeply divided societies and also very polarizing to us. That in a polarized, deeply divided society, your social identity determines your quality of life. It leads to communities of fear and isolation. It leads to conflict between majority and minority social identities. And unfortunately, the US is one of many countries in the world today that is experiencing many of these deep and polarizing divisions. Next slide, please. We see this even in our choices, to what degree we can choose, our choices based on who we live by. This was an article from the New York Times from last year that looked at residential segregation in large cities across the US. Democrats and Republicans effectively segregated from each other, not because of red states and blue states, but red neighborhoods and blue neighborhoods. And those deep divisions we talk about even exist to the extent of determining in large part who we choose to associate with in terms of residential life when we have those choices to make. Next slide, please. So I think a second way forward for us is to think about ways we can resist this type of polarization around identity politics. And much of our deeply divided social identities today have become political identities and meshed with a lot of other identities, but really thought about as political identities. And I think in many ways, as we look at ourselves, we are focusing very often on differences and division rather than the similarities and the bonds. We're focusing on the things that divide us rather than the things that unite us. And every generation has its struggles with that, but we seem to be particularly caught in a time where we've lost the ability to see the things that unite us, to see the things that bring us together, to see the similarities over and beyond the differences that divide. Next slide, please. I think a third challenge is abuse of social media. Next slide, please. When social media came into our lives, and many of us remember this time, it was a great force of freedom and democracy. Social media was going to give voice to people that had not had a voice before, that we would hear perspectives we had not heard before because social media would enable and give a platform for those type of voices. And that has happened, but there's been a downside to that as well. And that social media has also provided platforms for people to amplify disinformation, to incite violence, and to lower levels of trust in media and democratic institutions. So it ties back to the ways in which we can protect democracy. Social media is being used to attack some of those basic underpinnings of democracy. Next slide, please. So I think here what we need to focus on is what are the ways we can counter bad news bias by focusing on the good news of democracy's heroes. There are a lot of good people doing incredible work at the front lines of democracy to make sure that democracy is inclusive, democracy is fair, democracy moves forward. A lot of times we don't hear about the actions of those incredible good actors at local levels and state levels and national levels because they're drowned out by a significant bad news bias that we see in a lot of our media. And I think each of us can reclaim the power of social media as a force for freedom and democracy. Facebook continues to be under attack because it hasn't yet figured out what are the ways it can not be used for the types of divisions that it's often used for the type of disinformation that it's often used for. So for those of us who are active on social media, absolutely we can reclaim it as a force for freedom and democracy. Next slide, please. I think our fourth challenge has to do with history and memory. Next, please. Martin Luther King wrote in 1963, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. We're perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out our indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. And as the opening prayer said, we live in the land of the Abenaki and Pennacook people as uninvited guests on this land. And to not recognize that we're a country founded on the twin evils of genocide, the extermination of one people, the attempted extermination of one people, and slavery, the economic exploitation of another people, imported specifically for that purpose. Those are the twin evils that this country was founded upon. To ignore that reality, to not discuss that reality, isn't going to do anything to help heal the deep divisions that we've been talking about. Next, please. In an interview last month, Nikki Giovanni was speaking about the work she does with her students. And she says, one of the first things I ask my students is, how many of you own slaves? Of course, none of them do. Then why are you afraid to talk about slavery, she asked. Why are you afraid of looking at the past? It's not what you did. There's no reason to be afraid of how we got to where we got. But why many people are afraid is that even if this is something we did not do, it is something that many of us had benefited from generationally. It is something that has harmed many of us generationally and impoverished many of us generationally. But there's no way of understanding who we are today without understanding that past and how it's infected our present. Next slide, please. So I think here our way forward is we have to interrogate our collective history and our collective memory. We have to ask ourselves, and in New Hampshire, we are dealing with this directly at the state legislature level because some legislators want to make it illegal within our classrooms to interrogate this history and to ask these hard questions. And I think the question we have to ask them is, are we as a nation so fragile that we'll collapse under the weight of our memory? Is that memory so devastating that it's going to wipe us out if we face it in its entirety? Because to not face it isn't going to move us forward. So I think we need to reclaim education as a public good, not to prepare people for trades and professions, but prepare people to be engaged and informed citizens. And you cannot be an engaged and informed citizen by turning a blind eye to the history of the country in which you live and work. Next slide, please. Our final challenge, I think, is the most disconcerting one for those of us who work in the field of political violence and genocide studies, is a challenge I wouldn't have thought I would have mentioned 3, 5, 10 years ago. And that's the challenge of political and civil violence. Next slide, please. The domestic terrorism threat is metastasizing in the US. I have the privilege of working often with FBI, Homeland Security, federal law enforcement officials in human rights trainings. And they have always said to me, what the government tends to focus on and what it pulls voters in by is international terrorism. We have to be afraid of them, those people who look different, those people who believe different. That's what we got to prepare for. But every agent I've ever talked to has said, we know where the biggest threat is. The biggest threat's here. The biggest threat is internal. The biggest threat is domestic terrorism. That may not be as easy to sell to constituents, but that's the threat. Next slide, please. Colleagues at the U.S. Army Academy in West Point, where I've spoken, I speak each year as well, have said that they're wrestling with the military's history of white nationalism. And they recognize that embedded in the military and its history and its culture and to some degrees its structures are things that threaten rather than protect some of our basic underpinnings of democracy. And to their credit, the military is wrestling with how do we understand this type of erosion that comes within our core. Next slide, please. Most recently, in a poll released just last month, 1 in 3 Americans say violence against the government could be justified in certain occasions. 1 in 3 Americans. This isn't a left or right issue. This is 1 in 3 of us who are willing to say in 2022 that under some conditions, violence against the government could be justified. And unfortunately, we saw those conditions manifest last January 6th. Next slide, please. So I think the fifth thing I want to say in terms of a way forward, we've talked about recognizing and reversing democratic backsliding, resisting polarization, countering the bad news bias, interrogating our collective history and collective memory. But in Dr. King's memory, this fifth one is very important. We have to go back to promote and nurturing nonviolence to foster political and social change. Violence is the easiest thing to do. It's the least creative thing to do. Violence is a failure of moral imagination to foster political and social change. Nonviolence is the harder track, but it's the track that we have to follow. The change we want to foster politically and socially, we have to have a recommitment to nonviolence. Next slide, please. James Baldwin, many of you recognize, a famous African-American author who once wrote, "Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I think for me, one of the important lessons of Martin Luther King commemorations is to do what he did, which is face what we have in front of us, be honest about the challenges, because until we do that, nothing can be changed until we've had a chance to face it head on. Next slide, please. President Biden has more recently put it more starkly, where he said, your children and grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy. That's what's at stake here. Many of us grew up in generations where we never thought we'd be in a position in the US of saying we've got to prove democracy works here, that we could be that much under threat. But that's the place we are today. And that's our challenge. Can we prove at the local level, the state level, and national level that democracy works? Final slide, please. So as Dr. Martin Luther King said, he challenged us in 1963. And in some ways, this is discouraging that we're still facing this now, 58 years later, 59 years later. But his challenge in 1963 was, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. And we've taken some steps forward since 1963, but we've taken some steps back. And I think the challenge is we go forward tonight with the rest of our program. Our challenge is now's the time to make real the promises of democracy. And do we really believe that every story has the capacity for a better ending? I do. And I know that you and I are both parts of helping drive that story to that better ending. And you've taken the first step by choosing to be here with us tonight for this commemoration, and we'll look forward to taking the next steps together. So we'll go now to the next part of the program, and thank you very much.
The Hutchinson Family Ensemble is composed of members of the Norway Pond Festival Singers, who came together to perform songs in celebration of placing a historic marker on the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire in Hancock. The ensemble takes its name in honor of the famous Hutchinson Family Singers, an innovative group of 11 brothers and 2 sisters who were the most popular American entertainers of the mid-19th century. As a full group, or quartet of 3 brothers and 1 sister, they popularized 4-part group singing in America and were notable for spirited songs on controversial issues such as abolitionism and women's suffrage. Because of the change in musical performances for our event from in-person tonight to recorded, only 1 member of the ensemble was able to participate. Soloist Eve Pierce will sing the rousing abolitionist song written by Judson Joseph Hutchinson in 1855 and popularized by the Hutchinson Family Singers, "Slavery is a Hard Foe to Battle."
I looked to the south and I looked to the west, and I saw slavery a-comin', with 4 northern dough faces hitched right up in front, driving freedom to the other side of Jordan. Then take off your coats and roll up your sleeves, slavery is a hard foe to battle. Then take off your coats and roll up your sleeves, oh, slavery is a hard foe to battle, I believe. If I were the legislature of these United States, I'd answer this great question according. I'd let every slave go free over land and on the sea.
have a little hope this side of Jordan. Then rouse up the free, the sword unsheath. Freedom is the best road to travel. Then rouse up the free, the sword unsheath. Oh, freedom is the best road to travel, I believe. The South have their school where the masters are to rule, and they lord it o'er the free states according. But sure they better quit ere they raise the Yankee grit, and we'll tumble them over to the other side of Jordan. Then rouse up the North, the sword unsheath. Slavery is a hard-fought battle. Then rouse up the North, the sword unsheath. Oh, slavery is a hard-fought battle, I believe. But the day is drawing nigh where slavery must die, and everyone must do his part according. So let us all unite to give every man his right, and woman too, and we'll get our pay the other side of Jordan. So take off your coats and roll up your sleeves. Slavery is a hard-fought battle. Then take off your coats and roll up your sleeves. Oh, slavery is a hard-fought battle, I believe.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Wheeler, and this is my first year as a member of the Jaffrey Ringe MLK Junior Committee. For our 2022 National Day of Service project, our committee held a community donation drive for the Afghan evacuees resettling in New Hampshire. We partnered with the International Institute of New England, the IINE, which is an agency who's been working on resettling evacuees in New England. And the donation drive took place in December 2021 in order to address the timely and pressing needs of the evacuees. The IINE has welcomed over 75 Afghan evacuees in New Hampshire and many more throughout New England. Our committee wanted to help and welcome and assist our new neighbors who arrived in the United States with almost no possessions after fleeing from their homes. We felt as though this project directly related to our theme this year, the power to heal. Thanks to the incredible generosity of our community, we raised over $3,000 in gift cards and monetary donations and collected over 70 boxes and 30 bags full of tangible donations, including microwaves, coffee makers, kitchenware, quilts, sheets, bedding, 3 room-sized rugs, boxes and bags full of winter clothes, hats, and mittens, portable cribs, stuffed animals, toys for children, and 16 bags full of school kits. And so much more. Thank you to all the Monadnock area residents and the residents of the surrounding communities who donated for our National Day of Service project. A special thank you to all the volunteers who helped with the sorting and packing of the goods, and to Tiga Realty, the Ringe Rec Department, and Conant High School for providing us with locations for our donation boxes. In addition to our community donation drive, Taylor and I have also been working in the schools this past month with our workshops about activism and helping others in the community.
Thank you, Megan. I'm Taylor Ratcliffe, and as Megan said, we have done some work with the Ringe Memorial School, the elementary school in Ringe, and we were so delighted to be able to meet all of the Ringe 5th graders and their teachers, Mrs. Hoden, Mrs. de Grandpré, and Mrs. Barney, and work with the students on how to become an activist. Megan put together a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, and the students were engaged and passionate and interested in the idea of becoming activists. They did posters afterward to kind of generate their own ideas and start themselves on the idea of being an activist in their community. They took issues as how to help our earth, how to create equal rights, helping animals that might be endangered. They had a lot of interest. It was really great to see. So that was a really nice experience. Next week we'll be meeting with the Jaffrey Grade School and be able to do the same PowerPoint and hopefully connect with them as well. I also want to talk about something very exciting that is happening this year. The Jaffrey Ringe Martin Luther King Committee was able to partner with Millipore Sigma of Jaffrey. And their generosity and outreach in the community has resulted in us being able to create a scholarship program where 2 graduating high school seniors from Jaffrey and Ringe will receive a $1,500 scholarship. So this scholarship is going to be based on student service in the community. So we're going to be asking students who are interested in, we're going to ask them to demonstrate the service they've done in the community, and they can present this in a number of ways. They can do photographs, they can have a video, they can write to us about it, but we want them to illustrate how they've been servants in their community. And what's really exciting about this is that we have a partnership with a very large pillar business in our community, Millipore, who's been a foundation in the community for the past 50 years. They are genuinely invested and interested in nurturing community and young people in our community, and with the hopes that they can one day be a part of their business here in Jaffrey, but also just to help the community as a whole, to help kind of generate and nurture enthusiasm in young people in the community. So it's really exciting. We're really looking forward to that, and that will be available to high school seniors in Jaffrey and Ringe, public school, private school, homeschool, any student in Jaffrey and Ringe. That will be available to them in February. So we're excited about that as well. Thank you very much.
In closing our special program in this 8th year, I give thanks to all of you for joining us this evening online. May our celebration inspire us to practice Martin Luther King Jr.'s example of love and kindness. Share the dream and live the reality of the beloved community.
The program guide for this evening is available on our Facebook page, MLK Celebration Jaffrey Ringe. For a printed program while supplies last, please write jaffreyringemlk@gmail.com. Please join us again this Wednesday, January 19 at 7 p.m. for Abolitionists of Noise Academy, a thought-provoking exploration with historian Dan Billen of the incendiary conflict over the opening of an integrated school in pre-Civil War Canaan, New Hampshire, followed by question and answer. This live virtual event is sponsored by New Hampshire Humanities. The program is free, but registration is required. Please go to MLK Celebration Jaffrey Ringe on Facebook for the registration link. We close with an astonishing and inspiring virtual concert, Heal the World, a tribute to Michael Jackson, produced by world music duo from India, Maati Baani, and performed by many very young singers and musicians.
Strong, only cares for joyful giving. And if we try, we shall see. In this place we cannot feel fear or dread. We stop existing and start living. Then it feels in our woods, preserve our animals and planting humankind as well, so that our future generations can have a story to tell. Protect us from evil and spread the word of good, of peace, love, justice, virtue, and brotherhood. Cause we only have one earth and we can't waste our motherland, so let's move as one force. I think it's time to take a stand.
Could fly so high and let our spirits never die. In my heart, I feel you are all my brothers. Create a world with no fear. Together we'll cry happy tears. Watch the nations turn their swords into plowshares. We could really get there if we cared enough for the living. Make a little space to make a better place. Do the world, make it a better place for you and for me. In time we made it wrong. Keep on dying if we get enough for living. Make a better place for you and for me. Build the world, make it a better place. Oh, you and for me, and the entire human race. There are people dying if we care enough for the living. Make a better place for you and for me.
Hey guys, that was Michael Jackson's Heal the World for you. If you like the song, subscribe to our channel, share, like, comment so that we can make more songs like this. To listen to more of our music, check out the links below.
We loved creating this song, and if you like the song, do press the like button, and children are listening to you. Comment.
We had a ball making this song, so check out how the song was made over the internet.